The little girl sat at the bottom of the crumbling townhouse steps, bare feet pressed to the warm cobblestone, her breathing shallow as if each inhale had to be bargained for. The hospital band slid loosely on her frail wrist, and in her arms she clutched a doll missing one eye. Sunset dripped gold over Charleston's moss-hung oaks, but the way she looked at Elias Ward cut through the beauty like a blade. "If you carry me up the stairs," she whispered, "I'll tell you a secret that might save someone's life." Elias, grease-stained from a day in the garage, stopped mid-step. Her voice wasn't playful, it was a quiet dare, the kind that made the hairs on his arms rise. He scanned the street, empty, except for the heavy air that tasted faintly of salt and rain. "Where's your mother?" he asked, but she only tilted her head toward the door at the top, eyes glassy yet unflinching. He hesitated. The mechanic in him knew weight and risk, but something about the way she held herself delicate, determined, pulled him in. When he lifted her, she clung like she'd been waiting for him all day. Halfway up, she leaned close to his ear, her breath trembling. "I wasn't supposed to tell anyone," she said, "but he's coming tonight. And if we don't stop him, my mum will disappear forever." Elias froze on the stairs, the world narrowing to the pounding in his chest and the scent of magnolias hanging in the dusk. He didn't know it yet, but carrying her through that doorway would change every hour of his life from that moment on. Under the pale wash of morning light, Charleston's battery stirred to life with the slow rhythm only this city knew. The breeze rolled in from the harbor, carrying the scent of salt and marsh grass, rattling the palmetto fronds that lined the cobblestone streets. Tucked 2 blocks inland, away from the grand white-columned houses facing the water, sat Ward's Auto Repair, an unassuming brick building with faded paint and a weathered tin sign that squeaked on windy days. Inside, Elias Ward worked alone, sleeves rolled, forearms darkened with oil. The steady clink of his tools, a metronome to his solitary life. In his mid-30s, Elias had the build of someone who had spent his life lifting engines and tires rather than weight-strong but unpolished. His hair, sun-browned and unruly, curled slightly at the nape. He spoke little, his words measured, his gaze often focused somewhere past the person he was talking to. The regulars at the garage called him dependable, though no one knew much about him beyond the fact that he could coax life out of machines most mechanics would write off as hopeless. Elias's days followed a pattern. Open the garage by 8, work until the shadows lengthened, and walk home through the narrow streets where live oaks spread their limbs like ancient guardians. That morning had been no different until the faint, uneven sound of small feet shuffling on stone made him glance up from tightening a belt on an old pickup. A child was sitting at the edge of the sidewalk across the street, knees drawn in, a doll clasped in her arms. Her hair was a tangle of dark curls that caught the light, her skin pale in a way that wasn't from lack of sun but from something deeper. She wore a yellow sundress that seemed too big for her, its straps sliding down one bony shoulder. Around her wrist, a hospital band lay loose, the inked letters smudged at the edges. Her breathing was shallow, the rise and fall of her chest uneven, as if every inhale required thought before he could cross to her. A woman stepped out of the townhouse behind the girl, Nora Callahan. Elias didn't know her yet, but the sight of her tall, lean hair pulled back into a quick knot carried the air of someone who was always rushing between one need and the next. Her nurse's scrubs were wrinkled, the navy fabric soft from too many washes, and a stethoscope's imprint faintly marked the curve of her neck. She had the tired grace of someone who had been holding a fragile thing for too long. "Leela, you can't sit out here without me," Nora said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of worry. She crouched beside the child, adjusting the straps of the sundress, then lifted her gaze to Elias. "Sorry if she's bothering you." "She's not," Elias replied simply. His voice was low, warm in a way that caught Nora off guard. For a moment, the three of them stood in a small triangle of stillness, the street quiet except for the distant call of gulls and the gentle hiss of the marsh wind through the palmettos. Lila looked up at him with the kind of frank curiosity only children possess. She didn't seem afraid of strangers, perhaps, because sickness had made her world too small to afford that luxury. Nora reached for her daughter's hand. "Come on, we need to get you inside." But before they turned away, Leela tilted her head toward Elias. "Do you fix things?" He nodded. "I try to. My doll's arm falls off sometimes." She held it out slightly, the fabric limb hanging loose where stitches had given way. Elias crouched, holding out his hand for the doll. I can fix that. Nora hesitated, her eyes scanning him the way one might assess a stranger on a dark street, not with fear exactly, but with the cautiousness of someone who had learned not to lean on anyone. You don't have to, it's no trouble, he said, already studying the loose seam. His hands were broad and calloused, yet they turned the doll gently, thumb brushing the frayed thread. I'll bring her back tomorrow, good as new. Leela's smile was small but genuine. Thank you. Mr. Nora gave a brief nod. All right, we'll be here. She took Lila inside, the old door closing behind them with a sigh of hinges. That night, as Elias walked home past the waterfront, the sky was painted in streaks of rose and amber, the tide whispering against the seawall. He thought about the girl's pale face, the quiet weight in her mother's voice, and the feel of that worn doll in his hands. He didn't know them, not really, but something about the exchange stayed with him. The next afternoon, when he knocked on the townhouse door, Lila was the one to answer. She wore the same yellow dress, but her hair had been brushed, and a faint blush of color touched her cheeks. The doll was in his hands, the arm firmly stitched, the fabric smoothed as if it had never been broken. You fixed her, Leela said, the light in her eyes almost startling. Told you I would. He handed it over, watching as she cradled it close. Nora appeared behind her, leaning on the doorframe. Thank you, she said, the words simple but edged with something unspoken. Gratitude, perhaps, or the discomfort of being in someone's debt. From that day, he began to notice them more. At the corner market, where Nora would stop after her shifts, Lila holding her hand and studying the jars of honey as if they were treasure. On the waterfront, where Lila liked to feed the gulls, her laugh, sharp and bright before a coughing fit, would steal it away. And sometimes, late at night, when the streets were empty, Elias would hear faint music drifting from the open window of their townhouse, the kind of music played to soothe a restless child. Charleston in early summer was a city of contrasts: heat, thick as syrup, breezes cool as river water, streets alive with tourists, yet pockets of silence where time seemed to fold. Elias's life had been one of those quiet pockets until now. He had no family nearby, no one waiting for him at the end of the day. The garage was his world, the hum of engines and the smell of oil his constants. But since meeting Leela and Nora, that world felt incomplete somehow. One evening, as he passed their street, he saw Nora sitting on the townhouse steps alone. Her elbows rested on her knees, her eyes fixed on nothing. He slowed, debating whether to speak. She's sleeping, Nora said without looking up. Bad day. The treatments take a lot out of her. Elias nodded, unsure what to say. You don't have to keep helping, she added after a pause. I know you're busy. I'm not too busy, he said. It was the truth. He didn't have much else to be. Finally, she looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, still guarded, but a fraction softer. All right, she said quietly. The breeze carried the smell of rain from the harbor, and the first drops began to fall, cool against the heat. They sat in silence, two strangers bound not by history but by the fragile thread of a child's smile. Elias didn't know where it would lead, but he felt, for the first time in years, that maybe his life had room for something more than machines and empty evenings. He didn't realize then how much that small decision to fix a doll, to return it, to linger would matter. In the low country light, with the marsh breathing and the palmettos swaying, the story had already begun. Elias began seeing Leela wherever his day wandered, a yellow dress at a window, a corkscrew curled behind lace, a small figure beneath live oaks that shaded the lane. Morning lay warm light over brick, while the harbor breeze stitched salt into every breath. At Ward's Auto Repair, he listened to idling engines and, without deciding, to glance toward the townhouse, expecting her with the patched doll held like a secret. When she appeared, he lifted a hand, and she lifted hers back, solemn as a signalman. He answered with small offerings. After closing, he walked to Sullivan's Island and searched the tide line until he found a shell that was pink inside. The spiral unchipped, he wrapped it in brown paper, wrote for Lila who listens, 2 waves, and left it on the bottom step. In the morning, she unwrapped it with ceremonial care, lifted it to her ear, and listened hard enough to hush traffic. When she lowered it, she held it toward him. He heard the ocean, and, beneath that, the faint rhythm of her breath. Nora watched. From the doorway, arms folded against her ribs, scrubs creased by long hours, hair knotted high. She carried the poise of someone who held other people's fear without letting it spill. Wariness hovered, yet it wasn't iron. It resembled a thin shell built fast around a tender center. "You didn't have to," she told Elias, nodding toward the shell. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." The exchange neither opened nor closed anything. It placed a small, steady light on the table between them. They began to drift the same way toward the battery when work ended and the air cooled. Cobbles knocked softly under their shoes. Carriages clopped past. A trumpet drifted from behind shutters. Magnolia petals lay like fallen china along the curb. At the seawall, Lila scattered crumbs saved from breakfast, and gulls spiraled down, wings flashing white, then tilted back into rings over the harbor like coins in a fountain nobody owned. She counted in a whisper, lost count, then started again, pleased by the mistake. The wind pressed salt against their tongues and left their skin tacky. "Do you fix only cars?" she asked, matching his stride with stubborn focus. "Mostly," he said. "Machines tell the truth if you listen long enough." She tested the idea, then pressed the shell to the doll's stitched arm so her companion could hear the ocean too. He pretended not to notice, honoring a right dot. One bright afternoon smelled of salt and hot sugar from a vendor cart. They paused. At the railing where small waves tapped stone with patient hands, Nora sat and patted the bench. Elias took the far end and left room for any boundary she needed. Lila stood between them, ribbon holding her hair back, ribbon tied by her own decision. "Name a boat," he said, folding a napkin into a tiny skiff and setting it afloat in a puddle left by high tide. "Magnolia," she declared, "because that's how Mum's hands smell when she braids my hair." Nora's posture softened as if the sentence touched a tender place. They watched the flimsy craft tack and turn until a gust nudged it under the lip of stone and the harbor adopted it. They talked like people testing new ground. Nora asked about repairs and parts. Elias described how old engines hide sorrow in sound, a purr masking fatigue, a rattle begging mercy. She told him she worked nights in a unit where monitors sang many alarms. He heard tiredness tucked between syllables and pretended not to, the way she pretended not to notice the scrapes on his knuckles. Lila leaned on the rail, shell to her ear, body still as a heron, while she listened for messages carried along the tide. "I have a secret," she announced, not with mischief but with the calm authority of a harbor pilot calling a turn. Nora went still. "It's a little one," Lila assured. She touched the doll's mended arm and looked at Elias. "Mummy cries at night," she said. "She thinks the pillows keep it quiet, but they get wet." The words slipped into the wind and rang like a bell. Nora's jaw moved. Color rose and fell along her throat. She did not apologize or explain. She looked at the water and steadied her voice. "We're okay," she said. "Some days are heavy." Elias nodded. Heavy things carry better with more than one pair of hands. He did not reach for her or try to fix the sentence. He let it be a bench. They walked home slowly, stopping for a blue heron lifting from marsh grass with paper-thin grace. At a bakery window glowing with butter and history, he bought a small loaf still warm. He broke a piece for Lila and slipped another into Nora's pocket with an awkwardness he didn't try to hide. Lila ate half and saved half with care that any grandmother would praise. At a corner shaded by a live oak, he knelt to tie her loosened laces. The bow came perfect on the first try. "There," he said, racing trim. She saluted as if launching dot days braided themselves. Chalk drawings appeared outside the garage each morning. Boats with faces, towers with flags, 3 stick figures under a sun too large to fail. In return, he left treasures on the townhouse step, a smooth stone veined like a map, a pressed azalea petaled between paper, a postcard clipped from a magazine showing a lighthouse in peach light. No signatures, only a penciled arrow pointing from each object to the word for. She never asked who. She knew. Nora's suspicion did not vanish. It learned to breathe alongside gratitude. At a neighborhood fair under drifting bubbles, she stood, with him beneath a crepe myrtle. A blues trio curled music through the heat. Lila spun until Balance filed a complaint. "You don't owe us anything," Nora said, not accusing or pleading, merely stating what should have been obvious. "I know," he answered. "Maybe that's why it matters." She studied him like she checked vitals. Something eased that, he could not name, thunder built over the harbor one evening, stitching pale lightning across the far horizon. The air felt like a held breath, shared by the whole city. Leela tired quickly. Her breathing turned rough, not yet frightening. Close enough to make time slow. Nora gathered her muscles tight with strain. She hid from everyone. Elias lifted the girl without ceremony. She settled against him as if designed for safe travel, eyes closing because the world finally granted permission. He carried her up the townhouse steps, aware of bones, heat, and trust. Inside, the hallway smelled of lemon and laundry soap. He set her on the couch and arranged a pillow beneath her knees. "Stay a minute," Nora said, pouring water. He sat, in a chair that looked older than most lives. Rain came loud and warm, rinsing heat from brick. Lila slept without twitching, one hand curled around the shell as though guarding the tide. "Some nights," Nora said, staring at nothing, "I feel like the whole city leans against us so we won't fall." "Maybe it does," he replied. "Maybe that's what neighbors mean." She walked him to the gate when the rain thinned. Streetlights trembled in puddles. The smell of wet stone rose like a memory of first storms. "Thank you," she said. The sentence carried weight in every letter. For the shell, for the bench, for bread, for the way you don't make it. A performance. He shrugged, unpracticed with praise. "I fixed what I can reach," he said. Today that included a latch and a tide of small worries. Rhythms found them. He tuned an engine at sunrise and left a paper crane at noon. She returned from her shift at dawn and drew chalk suns by 8. Lila counted gulls, lost count, then began again, perfectly pleased by the failure. They built something modest, a scaffold of gestures, each strong enough to hold the next. None of it promised miracles. All of it promised the company. On a late afternoon hammered into gold, they paused at the seawall again. Wind lifted and rang rigging like distant chimes. Lila stood between them, head tilted, listening for music inside metal. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "I do," he said. "Boats hum when they rest." She considered that and slid her hand into Nora's, her other into his, natural as breath. The three of them faced the harbor as if it were a stage where the tide performed the oldest story in circulation. The harbor kept its secret. Some kindnesses change lives. Have you ever helped a stranger? Wind drove sheets of rain sideways against the narrow windows of the townhouse, each gust rattling the panes like urgent fists. The air had turned heavy hours earlier, pressing low on Charleston's rooftops, and by nightfall, the streets had become shallow rivers reflecting fractured streetlight. Palmetto fronds thrashed in the storm, bending until they nearly kissed the waterlogged pavement. Elias sat in his garage, the doors bolted against the weather, tools laid in quiet rows on the bench. The smell of oil mingled with the damp creeping. Through the brick, he was tightening a distributor cap on a '78 pickup when his phone vibrated. The name on the screen made him drop the wrench without thinking. "Elias." Nora's voice came ragged over static and wind. "It's Lila. She can't catch her breath. I called for an ambulance, but they said the streets are flooding. They can't get through." He didn't ask questions. "I'm coming, now." Rain struck his face like handfuls of gravel as he ran to the truck. The wipers flailed against a torrent they couldn't keep up with. He eased into the street, feeling the water push against the tires. The engine's growl steady beneath him. Headlights found nothing but a blur of rain. Each drop caught for a heartbeat before vanishing into black. Charleston under a storm was a city, remade shadows pooling in alleys, gutters spilling over, the old cobblestones slick as glass. A carriage, horse stood ghost-like in the downpour. Reins slack. Driver hunched under a tarp. Elias turned onto Nora's street, water curling round his hubs. The townhouse loomed in the beam of his lights, its steps glistening with runoff. Nora was already at the door, hair plastered to her head, scrubs clinging to her frame. She held Lila close, the girl's chest rising and falling in shallow, wheezing effort. The patched doll dangled from her small hand, soaked to the stitching. "She's getting worse," Nora said, voice trembling but eyes sharp. Elias reached for the child. "Let me take her." His arms closed around Lila's small frame, heat radiating through the damp fabric of her dress. She didn't resist. Her fingers curled into the collar of his jacket. The truck's cabin filled with the sound of the storm rain on the roof, tires hissing through pooled water, the occasional thud of debris against the undercarriage. Streetlights blurred into halos as they passed. Nora kept one hand on Lila's knee, the other gripping the dashboard whenever the truck swayed against the flood's current. "You're going to be okay," Elias said, eyes fixed on the narrow band of road visible through The windshield. He shifted down for traction, the engine's tone dropping into a low, relentless note. The battery's seawall rose on their right, waves smashing over it in white bursts that vanished into spray. Palmettos bowed and snapped back like desperate swimmers. Halfway to the hospital, the truck jolted over a branch hidden under the water. Lila gasped, the sound sharp enough to cut through the storm's roar. Elias glanced down. Her face was pale, lips edged with blue, eyes fixed on him with startling clarity. "I have another secret," she whispered, voice barely a thread against the noise. He leaned closer without taking his eyes off the road. "Tell me." Her breath shuddered. "I'm not scared of being sick. I'm scared of Mom being alone if I go." Something inside him tightened, the kind of wrench you feel deep in the chest, the kind no tool can loosen. "You're not going anywhere," he said, steady as a promise. Even as the water climbed higher along the tires, they hit a stretch of meeting street, where the storm had turned intersections into small lakes. He kept the truck moving in a slow, deliberate crawl, letting the bow wave push debris aside. Lightning cracked open the sky, and for an instant the city was a black and white photograph, steeples sharp against the glare, water streaming off iron balconies. The world caught mid-breath. Nora checked Lila's pulse with the quick efficiency of a nurse who has counted too many. "She's fading," she said. Elias pressed harder on the accelerator. The hospital's glow finally cut through the darker, soft, steady light that seemed impossibly far and blessedly near at once. He swung into the emergency bay, brakes hissing on wet pavement. Orderlies in rain-slick jackets rushed forward, a gurney between them. Lila's fingers clung to his until the last possible moment. Her doll pressed between them, the fabric still damp and smelling faintly of marsh air. "Stay," she mouthed. Before they wheeled her inside, Nora looked back once as she followed, rain streaking her face. "Thank you," she said, not in relief, not yet, but in recognition of something larger than a single night's rescue. Elias stood in the wash of the truck's headlights, rain pouring from the brim of his cap, heart pounding with the rhythm of the storm. Somewhere inside that building, under the hum of machines and the press of urgent hands, a small girl's fight continued. And he knew without needing to think about it that, whatever came next, he would be there to meet it. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee that had been sitting too long on a hot plate. Beyond the glass doors, the storm had begun to fade, leaving puddles that mirrored the sodium yellow glow of the hospital's floodlights. Marsh frogs croaked somewhere in the darkness beyond the parking lot, their slow rhythm oddly steady against the hum of machines inside. Elias sat in a molded plastic chair, his jacket draped over his knees, water still dripping from his cuffs. Across from him, Nora leaned forward, elbows braced on her thighs, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles shone. Every few seconds, she glanced toward the double doors at the end of the hall, the ones Lila had disappeared through in a rush of voices and rolling wheels. "They said they'll update us," she murmured, though it sounded more like she was speaking to herself. "I'll wait with you," Elias replied, his voice quiet but certain. She looked at him, eyes searching for the catch. The reason she found nothing but the calm persistence of someone who had already decided. The minutes stretched, heavy and slow. Elias's mind drifted to another set of doors, another long night. Years ago, he had been 19, sitting in a hospital 2 towns over, the air heavy with the smell of rain and the metallic temps of fear. His younger brother, Sam, had been 12, full of reckless energy until the fever took hold. He remembered the feel of the cheap vinyl chair under him, the weight of his mother's hand gripping his own as if she could anchor herself that way. Sam had smiled faintly when Elias leaned over his bed and whispered something about fixing his bike when he got home. He never did. That night had left a hollow space in him, one he had carried like a quiet scar. He never spoke of it, but the echo of his brother's facepell under the harsh light had lived in the corner of his memory ever since. When he saw Lila's small hand clutching her doll, when he heard the uneven rhythm of her breathing, that memory had stirred. A nurse approached, her shoes squeaking faintly on the polished floor. "She's stable," she said, looking first at Nora, then at Elias, as if to acknowledge the shared weight in their waiting. "They've started treatment to ease her breathing. It'll take a little while, but she's responding." Nora exhaled, slowly, the kind of breath that seems to drain weeks of fear in one release. She stood, hands trembling, and Elias rose with her. "Can I see her?" Nora asked. "Just one at a time for now." the nurse replied, but she's awake. Nora hesitated, glancing toward Elias. Stay here, please. He nodded, settling back into the chair as she disappeared through the doors. The quiet of the waiting room closed around him again. Outside, the storm had broken entirely, leaving the streets slick and the air cool. Through the high windows, he could see the shimmer of water on the marsh and the faint outline of herons moving in the distance. When Nora returned, her face had softened, though exhaustion still pulled at the corners of her eyes. She sat beside him, this time without the guarded angle of her shoulders. She asked if you were here, she said, almost as if she couldn't quite believe it herself. I'm here, Elias replied. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of footsteps and distant monitors filling the space between words. Then, quietly, Nora asked, why? You barely know us. Elias thought about giving her the simple answer that it was the right thing to do, but something about the rawness in her voice asked for more. He told her about Sam, about the long night and the broken bike, about how helplessness can carve its way into a person and never quite let go. I couldn't change what happened then, he said, his gaze fixed on the floor, but maybe I can stand where I'm needed now. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter, almost tentative. Most people run from this kind of thing. It's easier not to get involved. Maybe, Elias said, but easier isn't always better. The nurse returned to let them both in, warning them to keep the visit short. Lila lay propped on pillows, her hair damp, eyes heavy-lidded but bright when she saw them. The doll rested beside her, its mended arm tucked under her hand. You came, she said to Elias, her voice thin but certain. Of course, he answered. He stood at the foot of the bed, unsure if he should step closer, until she lifted a hand toward him. He moved to her side, letting her small fingers curl around his dot. Nora watched from the opposite side, something unspoken passing through her expression. Trust, still fragile but undeniably forming. The monitors hummed softly, their steady beeps, like a metronome for the room's quiet. Outside, the glow of the sodium lights pooled across wet pavement, turning it to molten gold. Somewhere in the marsh, the frogs sang again, their chorus low and rhythmic. It was a sound Elias had always associated with the end of storms, the moment when the world exhales and begins to steady itself. As they left the room, Nora walked beside him, her steps no longer set to the quick pace of someone keeping distance. You don't know what this means, she said. Maybe I do, Elias replied. They reached the waiting area, and for the first time since the night began, Nora's shoulders eased. She didn't smile, not exactly, but the hardness in her gaze had softened. You stayed when you didn't have to, she said. Moments of care can heal more than we know, he said, almost without thinking. Who's been there for you? She didn't answer right away, but the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge being built, plank by careful plank. Outside, the night stretched calm and clear, the storm's chaos replaced by the steady pulse of a city that, for now, had returned to breathing. The garage was quiet except for the faint hum of the old ceiling fan and the distant hiss of the marsh beyond the narrow alley. Charleston at night had its own language, frogs croaking in slow rhythm, the occasional clang of a buoy bell carried in from the harbor, and the whisper of wind through palmetto fronds. Elias sat at the battered workbench, not with a carburetor or a set of spark plugs before him, but with his laptop open, its glow painting his face in cold light. It was well past midnight, but fatigue had no claim on him tonight. His hands, stained faintly with oil, moved carefully over the keyboard as he sifted through pages of donor registries. He had never been the kind of man to spend hours in front of a screen, but now each click carried a weight he could feel in his chest. The hospital's words echoed in his head. Lila's condition wasn't improving enough. A bone marrow transplant might be her only real chance. He searched quietly, knowing this wasn't something he could discuss with Nora yet. Her pride was a wall built stone by stone, and her exhaustion was already eroding the foundation. Every time he'd seen her over the past week, there had been more shadow under her eyes, more stiffness in her voice. She was working extra shifts, taking calls from billing offices in hushed tones, folding receipts into her pockets, as if hiding them could make them less real. He found a potential LIDA donor list with a match percentage higher than most. The details were locked behind forms and medical contacts, and he began drafting emails, careful with every word. He explained Lila's case without betraying the trust of her mother. focusing only on the urgency. His fingers paused above the keys more than once, the thought creeping in. What if the match didn't come from somewhere else? What if it came from him? The idea had taken root quietly after the hospital visit. Now it grew stronger with each dead end, each unanswered email. He remembered his brother Sam's hand in his, the way he'd wished for someone, anyone, to walk in with the solution. If there was even a chance that person could be him for Lila, he couldn't ignore it. Outside, a freight train groaned across the bridge, its lights a slow procession over the water. Elias leaned back, rubbing the grit from his eyes, and listened, until the sound faded into the night. Then he sent the message, one that would start the process of testing himself as a possible donor. The next morning, he found Nora on the townhouse steps, her hair pulled back, scrubs wrinkled from another night shift. A stack of envelopes sat beside her, bills, marked urgent in red print. She didn't bother hiding them this time. It feels like it's all happening faster than I can catch up, she said, looking out at the street rather than at him. Elias sat beside her, the wood damp from the morning dew. The low country was just waking sky, painted in streaks of peach and lavender, marsh grass shimmering as the tide eased in. You've been carrying all of it alone, he said. She gave a short laugh, though it held no humor. What choice do I have? He didn't answer because the choice he was making in secret was one she wasn't ready to hear yet. Later that day, he found Lila in the small courtyard behind the townhouse, crouched over a row of potted herbs. She looked up with a smile that seemed brighter than her pale cheeks should allow. Mum says Basil needs sunshine, but I think it likes talking better, she told him, patting the soil gently. Then you're doing it right, Elias replied, kneeling to help her water the plants with a chipped ceramic mug. She leaned closer, voice lowering to that conspiratorial tone she seemed to reserve just for him. I have another secret, she said. Elias smiled faintly. You're full of those. This one's about you, she continued, serious now. Mom acts like she's still deciding if she trusts you, but I already do. I think you're supposed to be here, like you're part of us somehow, even if Mom hasn't figured it out yet. The words settled over him heavier than any wrench or gear. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, letting the moment rest between them. As the days passed, the urgency inside him sharpened. He worked in the garage during the day, keeping up with repairs, but every night he returned to the laptop. He followed up with registry coordinators, filled out medical questionnaires, and arranged for his own preliminary tests, driving quietly to a clinic outside the city to avoid questions. Charleston moved through late summer around him. Tourists walking Rainbow Row with ice cream dripping down their hands, shrimp boats easing back into harbor under skies that shifted from blazing heat to sudden downpour in minutes. The beauty of it all felt sharper now, like a backdrop he was seeing through two lenses, the one where life carried on, and the one where a small girl's clock was ticking louder each day. One evening, after a long stretch of unanswered calls, his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end confirmed what he had been hoping for and fearing. In equal measure, he was a strong candidate for a match. They explained the process, the risks, and the recovery. He listened without interrupting, committing every word to memory. When he ended the call, the marsh was awash in the orange light of sunset, the tide drawing long glassy reflections between the reeds. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, the frogs beginning their slow song again. This wasn't a decision he had to make. It was one he already had. The next time he saw Nora, she looked worn thin but carried a kind of quiet resilience. Lila was curled on the couch, the doll tucked under her chin, fast asleep. Nora lowered her voice. She told me you've been spending more time with her than anyone else lately. She says you listen better than most people talk. Elias gave a small shrug. Maybe she just has better things to say. Nora studied him for a moment, as if weighing a question she wasn't ready to ask. Instead, she said, I don't know why you've done all this for us, but thank you. He nodded, keeping the rest to himself for now. The emails, the tests, the quiet choice to step into something that could change all of them. That night, long after the streetlights blinked on and the city's noises softened, he sat in the garage again, laptop closed this time. The only sound was the slow ticking of the cooling engine in the corner, and beyond that, the low hum of the low country settling into darkness. He thought of the sunrise over the marsh, the pink sky over the water, the way Lila's voice had carried certainty when she said he was meant to be there, and he knew that soon, Very soon, she would find out just how right she had been. Morning broke clean after a night of unsettled wind. The harbor brushed smooth as hammered silver, and the call from the hospital arrived like an exhale Nora had been holding for months. A donor match had been found for Lila. Anonymous, the coordinator, said gently, carrying the word as if it might bruise. Nora sat on the townhouse steps with the phone to her ear and watched a bread truck slide along wet cobbles while palmetto fronds clicked softly overhead. She asked every question she could think to ask, then one more about timing, and the coordinator's cautious answers still sounded like a door opening. She ended the call and covered her eyes with both hands. The city smelled, rinsed, and new. Somewhere, a bell tested a single note and went quiet again. Relief rose like sunlight, then faltered. Anonymous meant gratitude without an address. Anonymous meant the mystery of intention. She turned to call Elias, and saw only the doorway across the street, his garage dark at an hour when his light usually burned. She sent a message, good news, call when you can, and waited for the grey bubble that never appeared. Elias did not come by at noon, nor by 2, nor by sunset when the marsh turned copper and gulls skimmed low like flung ribbons. Nora told herself he was trapped under a car, covered in grease, muttering at stubborn bolts. She called again and reached only voicemail. The air thickened with a worry she did not want to name. She walked the block, then 2, and returned to find Lila on the rug with her doll and the shell pressed to her ear. I can hear the tide, Lila said. It says, be brave. Nora kissed her hair and smiled, because the child needed the smile more than the truth. Unable to sit still, she walked the historic district, letting her feet choose streets older than her thinking. On Church Street, the steeples rose like guardians, pale against a sky the color of pewter. When the hour marked itself, the bells lifted and rolled over the city, slow and round, touching slate roofs, iron balconies, and oaks veiled with moss. She stopped beneath one of those oaks and pressed her hand to the bark, the vibration traveling into her bones. A thought she had resisted stepped forward and looked her in the eye. Anonymous might mean someone she already knew. She could not bring herself to believe it, and could not make herself look away from the possibility. Dawn gathered in pale bands over the marsh, while the hospital moved with contained urgency. Lila looked very small against her pillows, but her gaze held steady. She squeezed Nora's fingers, asked for the shell, and listened as if the ocean itself might answer from within the spiral. When the nurses rolled her toward pre-op, Nora walked alongside until the double doors made her stop. She kissed Lila's forehead and whispered promises she had no power to guarantee. Then she curled into a waiting room chair with both feet braced on the floor and breathed as if the act required skill. The coordinator met her with forms and careful phrases. Anonymous donor, healthy, nearby, recovery underway. Those last 2 words snagged like a fishhook. Recovery underway meant someone was already here, marked by tape and tiredness, giving without ceremony. The thought from the night before rose. Again, complete now. Nora excused herself for air, turned down a quiet corridor, and followed signs that curved like river bends until she reached post-op. He lay half-turned toward the window, face pale, mouth set in the soft surrender of someone who has finally put down a heavy thing. A monitor traced his pulse in calm green. His hands were wrapped where needles had run. Bruises freckled his forearms like watercolor shadows. When the nurse glanced up and recognized her, understanding brightened the woman's expression. You must be Nora, she said kindly. He asked us not to page you. Said you'd try to talk him out of it. She adjusted a line and moved away, leaving the room quiet except for the machines steady him. Nora stepped to the rail because her knees wobbled. The bells from St. Michael's drifted through the glass. 1, 2, 3, each note round as a held breath. The steps, the doll, the truck in the rain, the bench by the seawall, the shell. The quiet way he made room for other people's fear. Every piece snapped into place. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, voice hardly above. The monitor's hummed. Elias opened his eyes as if climbing from deep water. Because you'd have said no, he answered, cracked and steady at once, and I needed to do it before I could hear that. He tried a smile and winced. How is she pre-op? Nora said. They said the donor was local and recovering. Her gaze took in the bruises, the tape, the curve of his mouth. You disappeared yesterday. I was here, he said. Tests, more tests. They said, I'm a strong match. He breathed once, slow. Closest thing to family. The sentence struck and opened something old. She wanted to say he owed them nothing, that his kindness had already knit their days together, that strangers do not cross lines like this, but he was not a stranger anymore. She placed her hand over his, careful of the bandage, and let 2 words hold everything. Thank you. They brought Lila into the operating theater while the city brightened, and time narrowed to a thrum Nora could feel in her teeth. She returned to the waiting room and counted 3 breaths between each minute. Rain came back as a whisper against glass, laying a pearly sheen across the parking lot. Each time panic lunged forward, she pictured Lila at the seawall, counting gulls, losing count, laughing between coughs, sunlight slanting on water like a promise she refused to release. A surgeon appeared with the careful expression of someone trained not to frighten with features. He sat beside her and drew a quick diagram on a scrap of paper using a pen borrowed from the desk. The match was strong. The transfer had begun clean. Her daughter's body would need time to accept the gift. There would be numbers that might mean nothing, and fevers that might mean everything. Nora listened, asked measured questions, and folded the paper with reverence, as if it were a letter ferried across a dangerous river. She carried the news back to post-op. Elias rested with his eyes closed, pain creasing his brow like a faint pencil line. She touched his shoulder, and he woke carefully, the way a mechanic tests an engine after a long silence. She repeated the surgeon's words, especially the phrase the transfer had begun clean, and watched relief loosen his jaw. Neither of them said miracle. Neither needed to dot. In late afternoon, the bells rang again, the sound fuller now, trembling the window glass. Nora stood and looked down at the historic district, breathing beneath the music carriages rolling, shutters flung open to new light, children hopping over puddles that held pieces of sky. Machines behind her kept slow time, while a small body negotiated with a stranger's marrow. She let the bells settle into her bones, each peal a note in a hymn she had forgotten she knew. Evening brought the call she had been bracing for. The surgery was successful. The first markers looked good. The next days would matter. Nora exhaled into her palms, and then looked at Elias, asleep again, mouth slack, stubborn jaw finally soft. A nurse adjusted his blanket and smiled. "Hardest kind of brave," she whispered. Nora's laugh broke and mended in the same breath. When they wheeled Lila to recovery, Nora walked beside the bed with her hand hovering an inch above her daughter's shoulder, as if touch might wake some delicate instrument too soon. Lila stirred and opened her eyes. "Did I miss the ocean?" she asked, voice rough with anesthesia, yet reaching for familiar things. "It came to you," Nora said. "You carried part of it inside." Lila smiled and drifted again. Hall, Elias shifted, waking as if called by a tide. He asked no questions, only looked at Nora. She nodded once, and the nod carried a contract between them that words could not hold. One person's choice can save a life. What's a choice you've made for someone? Spring settled over Charleston like a warm hand, softening the edges of winter's memory. The marsh grass shifted from dull brown to bright green, the air carrying both the sweetness of azaleas and the salt of the harbor. Weeks had passed since the surgery, and each morning brought a new measure of Lila's strength. She no longer woke with that deep, dragging fatigue. Her cheeks held color again, and her laughter came without the shadow of a cough. The hospital checkups grew less frequent, and the townhouse began to feel like a home instead of a waiting room. The patched doll still had its place on her bed, but now it often lay forgotten while she sketched. Crooked houses in bright chalk on the front steps, or braided flowers into Nora's hair. Elias, more often than not, was there beside them sometimes, fixing a loose shutter, sometimes leaning against the railing with a mug of coffee, watching as if memorizing the sight. One Saturday, Nora suggested they walk to Rainbow Row. It was Lila's idea. Really, she had overheard her mother describing the painted houses to a neighbor and wanted to see them for real, not just in pictures. The sky was cloudless, the air warm but stirred by a forgiving breeze. The streets were alive with the sound of carriage wheels, shop bells, and the faint notes of a street violinist playing near the Battery. When they reached East Bay Street, the houses stood like a string of bright promises, pinks, blues, yellows, and greens glowing in the sun, their shutters thrown open to the day. Lila gasped and immediately began assigning each of them to someone. "That one's mine," she said, pointing to a soft teal house, "because it looks like the ocean." She gave Nora the pastel pink one, because it's happy, and Elias. The deep blue house, because it feels steady, like you. They wandered slowly, stopping for Nora to snap pictures of Lila against the backdrop of blooming azaleas. In one, Elias knelt so Lila could place a flower crown she'd made from fallen petals on his head. He grumbled in mock protest, but his eyes gave him away. There was no place he'd rather be. The easy rhythm between the three of them felt unforced now, each step and laugh fitting naturally into the shape of their shared days. They ended up on a bench overlooking the water, Rainbow Row curving behind them and the harbor opening wide in front. The tide whispered against the seawall, and a shrimp boat drifted lazily toward the horizon. Lila busied herself arranging her seashell collection on the bench between them, humming under her breath. Nora leaned back, her face turned toward the sun, and Elias found himself watching her more than the view. "You've never told me much about it before," Nora said, not opening her eyes. He hesitated, tracing the grain of the bench with his thumb. "Not much to tell. I grew up outside Columbia. My parents split when I was a kid. Sam, my brother, was the one I spent most of my time with. He was 10 when I was 16. Full of questions, full of plans." His voice softened. "He got sick. One of those things that goes from a cough to something bigger before you even know what's happening. We lost him." Nora's eyes opened, her gaze steady on him. "That's why you stayed at the hospital. Why you—" She let the sentence trail off, but he nodded. "I couldn't fix it for him," Elias said, the wind tugging gently at his hair. "But I could be there for her." He tilted his head toward Lila, who was now organizing the shells by color. Nora reached across the bench and touched his hand. A simple gesture, but warm with understanding. "You didn't just help her, you helped me, too." They sat in quiet, for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. A pair of gulls swooped low, their cries sharp against the softer backdrop of the city. The bells from St. Michael's drifted over the rooftops, slower now, as if marking a gentler time. As they walked home, Lila skipped between them, holding one of their hands in each of hers. Near the townhouse, she tugged them both to a stop. "I have a last secret," she announced, eyes bright and serious. Elias smiled. "Another one. The last one," she said firmly. She looked up at her mother first. "I wished for you to be happy again." Then she turned to Elias. "And I think you are now, right?" Nora blinked, a tear catching the light before she could brush it away. "I am," she said, her voice steady. "Because of both of you." They climbed the steps together, the late sun spilling gold across the street. Inside, the smell of something baking. Elias's attempt at cornbread filled the air. Lila darted to the kitchen to check on it, calling back instructions that made them both laugh. In that moment, there was no need to name what they had become. The shape of it was clear in the way they moved through the same doorway, in the way their voices layered easily over one another, in the way the day's light seemed reluctant to leave. Family isn't just blood, it's who shows up. Who's your chosen family? The garden glowed as evening settled over Charleston, the low branches of the live oaks draped with strands of fairy lights that swayed gently in the salt-touched breeze. Beneath them, long tables were dressed in white cloth, their edges weighted with small jars of wildflowers, azaleas, magnolia blooms, and sprays of marsh grass tied with ribbon. The air was warm but softened by spring's easy grace, carrying the mingled scents of lemon cake, fresh-cut flowers, and the faint briny breath of the nearby harbor. Lila's 6th birthday was nothing extravagant, but it felt like the whole city had lent a hand. Neighbors had set up extra chairs, Nora's co-workers had baked pies, and one of Elias's customers had dropped off a portable speaker that now hummed with soft music. Children darted between the tables, chasing bubbles that floated like drifting pearls. Lila moved among them with a lightness none of them could have imagined a few months earlier, her hair catching the light, cheeks flushed with health, laughter spilling freely. Elias stood near the edge of the garden, watching her spin under the oak branches, her patched doll tucked under one arm even as she danced. He held a small box in his hands, its paper plain, but folded with care. When Lila noticed him, she hurried over, curiosity bright in her eyes. "What's that?" she asked. "Something that needed fixing," he said, handing it to her. She tore the paper carefully, revealing a small wind-up toy horse. Its once broken leg, now mended so seamlessly it was hard to tell where the damage had been. She turned the key, and the horse began to trot across the table, its motion steady and sure. Lila's smile spread slowly, the kind that starts in the eyes. "It works again," she whispered. And then, looking up at him, like me, Nora, standing nearby, felt the words catch in her chest. She had spent so long bracing against bad news, so long guarding herself against hope, that she hadn't noticed when it had quietly returned. Watching her daughter, now stronger, laughing, chasing bubbles, felt like watching the marsh come alive after winter, the green pushing through without needing permission. She looked at Elias, at the quiet way he stood among the guests, never at the center but always within reach. "You didn't just help her heal," she said when they found a moment alone by the cake table. "You helped me believe again." He shook his head slightly, eyes on Lila. "I just showed up." "Exactly," she said, and let the silence between them carry the rest. As the sun sank lower, the fairy lights grew brighter, turning the garden into a little pocket of magic. The birthday candles flickered in the soft wind, and everyone joined in the song, voices uneven but warm, the kind of chorus you only hear when people truly mean it. Lila closed her eyes to make her wish, her small hands cupped around the flame, and for a moment, the entire garden seemed to hold its breath. When she opened them again, she blew out the candles in one steady breath. Later, with the children sprawled on blankets under the trees, chasing the last of the cake crumbs, Lila climbed into her mother's lap. "Remember my last secret?" she asked, leaning close so only Nora could hear. "You mean the one about me being happy?" Nora replied. Lila nodded. "I think it came true." She glanced toward Elias, who was crouched, helping a toddler catch a bubble in cupped hands. "And I think we're supposed to keep him." Nora laughed softly, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "I think so too." The night deepened into that soft, hushed Charleston darkness, the air still warm, but touched with the cool promise of the harbor. Guests began to drift away, leaving the garden quieter, the fairy lights swaying overhead like slow-moving fireflies. Elias joined Nora and Lila at the long table, the three of them sitting close as if the chairs had been built that way. Nora looked around the garden, at the oaks, the flowers, the small wind-up horse still resting on the table. This wasn't just a birthday party, it was a marker, a moment that divided the life they had survived from the one they were building. It was proof that second chances didn't always come as grand gestures. Sometimes they arrived in the form of someone willing to knock on your door and ask if they could fix a doll. Hope, she realized, was less like a sudden blaze and more like those fairy lights, small points of warmth, strung patiently over time, until you could finally stand back and see they had made something beautiful. If you've ever felt alone, if you've ever wondered whether your kindness could matter, this story is proof that it can. One person's choice, whether to stop on a rain-soaked street, to stay in a waiting room, or to give a piece of themselves, can change the shape of a life forever. Family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one you build, moment by moment, act by quiet act. What happened next will inspire you. Join us to find out. Share your own story of courage, of love, of showing up when it mattered most. Join Heartfelt Stories to discover more tales like this story that remind us that even the smallest gesture can echo for a lifetime. Who's your chosen family?